Welcome to another exciting session of the Jordan Center Colloquium. We have with us Kristy Ironside, who's with us from the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. She's a graduate of Toronto, worked to be with the Canadian educational system to give us our graduate students. And Toronto, and after Toronto with Chicago, where she worked with Sheila Fitzpatrick. I think she was Sheila's last year.
I was.
Right? And has since been revising her dissertation, coming up with multitude of articles. Her general work is really about, it's economic history, but it's working its way outwards toward a larger political economy also of the post-war Soviet era, with a particular interest in money, as I understand, which she'll tell us about, I'm sure. The paper today, you'll have read it already. It's a draft article, and just to remind everybody of the format and the tenor. We assume that this is not a final draft, so we don't...
It is not a final draft.
Yeah, so we don't hold her accountable for the final words in here, and we're flexible about it, and she in turn is open to criticism, because that's the purpose of the colloquium. Without further ado, Kristy.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to New York. It was wonderful to get out of Moscow for a few days, for obvious reasons.
So you can warm up, eh?
Yeah, well actually the weather is much warmer there. I'm not joking at all, there was no snow when I left. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about the larger book project, how I came across this topic, and how this sort of grew out of the larger research I've been doing on money and the post-war period. So my book project, which is tentatively entitled The Workers' Ruble, Money and the Pursuit of Communist Prosperity in the Post-War Soviet Union, is looking at how money, which was this very problematic thing already under Soviet socialism, it wasn't necessarily supposed to exist, it was maybe a vestige of capitalism, how it was mobilized toward rebuilding after the war and also building communist prosperity. So what exactly did it mean to build a prosperous society? So I'm doing a sort of social economic approach to this. I'm looking primarily at the money that circulated in the household economy and the domestic economy. There was an intentional split in the Soviet economy between the money for bank transactions, for inter-firm transactions, and then the money that people got paid in, that they spent in the stores, etc. I'm looking at that aspect of the money economy. So I'm looking at how people were paid, how they tried to reduce income inequality, increase pensions, strengthen the ruble after wartime inflation, all these kinds of things. So this article grows out of the chapter that's dealing with this attempt, and it's sort of discussed a bit in the article, in 1960 to get rid of income taxes altogether, this abolition of taxes from the people. As I was doing the research for that, I came across the bachelor tax, which I had known about, but didn't quite realize it was as complicated as it turned out to be. So I've been in the Ministry of Finance files, going through these files, and I came across all of these letters, thousands of letters, people writing in about all of the various ways that they felt that they were slighted by this tax, that they shouldn't have to pay it, or they should get out of it, or criticizing the logic of the tax, why it was charged the amount it was, and also questioning what it was supposed to do exactly. Because as it turned out, there seemed to be this big schism between the way that Khrushchev talked about the tax publicly, the way that ordinary people understood the tax, and the way that the Ministry of Finance understood it. So what I discovered was that there was really this attempt to try and reconcile it with their larger ideas about direct taxation, and to try and make it be something that wasn't so instrumental of people, trying to force them to have more children. So they come up with this kind of cost-sharing logic, as I'm calling it for lack of a better word, where it's about redistributing the burden of how much it costs to have children, rather than trying to penalize people. Of course, in practice, nobody bought this, right? Everybody felt, okay, I'm being taxed because I'm not having children, but there are so many good reasons not to have children after the war. I mean, there's a famine right after the war, people starved to death, all kinds of diseases, there's nowhere to put these kids, nowhere to feed them, and of course, men are also let off the hook financially for these children. So I'm trying to kind of tell two stories in this article. One is the social response and all of the sort of the ways that they try to grapple with all of the problems people face in this post-war society, and then the fiscal problems, because they need the money, on the one hand, even though it's never an enormous amount of revenue. It's very hard to do away with a source of revenue once you've created it, and how they try to distribute that cost among the various segments of society. So, this is not necessarily a Soviet story. Many countries turn to tax policy to try and influence family size, but the Soviet Union has specific tax constraints, and that's the other thing I'm trying to flesh out, particularly as it affects the countryside. So, I don't want to go much more beyond that. I'm really happy to hear questions, criticisms, what you'd like to see more of, what you found perplexing about it, and anything else, because this is one of those projects where I had no shortage of sources. I could just keep going with it. So this is, if you can believe it, the trimmed down version. So I'll leave it there.
Adam, the last part?
Yeah, thank you for the paper. It's fascinating. I really enjoyed it, and it's also a completely new world for me. I don't work in the Soviet period, and I've never thought very much about taxes. So I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit as background about how people experience taxes. So, for example, you know how in the U.S. Europeans are always distressed by the fact that there's a tax added on when you get to the cashier.
Right.
It's not included in the price that you see. Where did people sort of see their taxes? And at one point, and so where did they actually feel that they were getting taxed? And at one point, you mentioned that people have to show up in person and physically pay their taxes.
Yeah.
Which is kind of amazing to me. Was
Yeah.
that common? You know, how did people experience it?
So it really depended on how you were socially categorized. So if you were a worker, it came off of your wages automatically. So the way that wages worked for most industrial workers in the Soviet Union is they mostly were paid in piece rates. So they had a base amount, and then they had a certain amount they earned above that. And then they would deduct from that amount taxes, party dues, union dues, this kind of stuff. So it fluctuated enormously, but I think for workers that meant that they didn't see it come off in quite the same way because that amount varied a lot. For peasants and for people who didn't have a regular wage, it was really different because they had to go and pay in person and they had to pay that lump sum. And especially for people who were not employed, that meant then that the person that they were financially dependent upon was paying their taxes for them. This is particularly a problem for these women who are married to war invalids, as I mentioned in the paper, because they had no formal sources of income except a pension. The pension was non-taxable. So they're double taxing these people. Those people felt it, and those people are the ones who write in complaining the most heavily about this. So I think it really depends on your perspective. The one problem in this source space is that then I don't see instances of people being indifferent to it, right? Because they don't write in. So there are the people who just get their wages and don't care, but then those who were probably financially well off didn't care about it and probably were also financially well off enough to have children, right? So they're just not, they're not reacting in the same way as the people who are forced to pay it differently. Yeah.
Well, we don't.
To what extent as the Soviets, the Ministry of Finance were debating, you know, what to do about these taxes, to what extent were they looking at what was going on in Western Europe post-war in terms of, you know, what kind of benefits you give to whom, you know, whether it's the French massive family allowance or the Swedes seem to be more on a provisioning of services to keep women in the labor force and get them to have children. What alternative models do they debate, and how did they end up with a system that seems to make it to sort of single people out rather than hide the benefits, like, so you have 2 children, then you get, you know, X amount tax deduction, which is, it's much more hidden than this tax.
No, it's a good question. I mean, so part of it is that this tax, Khrushchev comes up with this tax. And actually, after I wrote this version, I found the document in the archives where he proposes this initially. And he absolutely understands this as a penalty. They're kind of saddled with that as a framework for it. So that penalty dimension is always there. But they are looking outside of the Soviet Union. They're very obsessed with the French model. They think it's quite good. The problem is that they're very loath to move to a benefits-based model because they don't think that's going to solve the birth rate problem quickly enough, for one thing. And they're also concerned about how they're going to deliver those benefits to peasants because they can't, the way that the agricultural tax is structured, they can't sort of deliver family benefits back to them because it's at the level of the household and there's no real way to offer it via deductions. They have deductions from the agricultural tax. If you have a family member who's away on the front and is mobilized, you get a deduction. You don't pay the agricultural tax. But it's mostly this kind of lump sum tax. It's sort of hard to tack it on. I get the sense that's their feeling about it. So they don't move toward this concession model, but people are pushing for it. There are voices within the Ministry of Finance that want this, but they just don't win out. Because I think they're still saddled with this punitive framework. They can never move beyond the punitive framework. Because Khrushchev says no. He consistently just says no. I mean, as late as in the late 1950s, they're saying this is just inefficient. Why don't we just pay people baby bonuses? Why don't we just, you know, offer some, because the only deduction that does exist is this one off the income taxes, and that's only if you have 4 or more dependents. That's not the reality of Soviet families. The average family in this period is something like 1.5. I mean, it's a mother and a child, a mother and her mother and a child. It's not a 4-member nuclear family. So there's a bit of magical thinking going on in terms of the family that they're orienting these policies around.
What does it tell you, the fact that they keep this punitive model? I mean, why would they keep it punitive? What does it tell us, in other words, about us?
Yeah, that's a very good
I
question.
mean, even as they seem to be rhetorically saying at points, it's about redistribution, sharing the burden. It's not
Right.
penalized.
I mean, that's how they frame it for sort of public consumption, right? But I think there's kind of two discourses going on simultaneously, where internally they say, we have to kind of admit, yeah, okay, this is what's happening. Even though you have people like this guy Maryakin saying, no, this is about cost redistribution. They don't necessarily see this as punitive initially because they do see it in terms of that redistributive model, because it's theoretically about capacity to pay. But I think by the early 50s, even the Ministry of Finance is starting to say, no, this is actually about punishing people. This is not efficient, but there's no political will to change it. There's just absolutely none, and they're stuck with this.
Why?
Why? Because I actually do think on some level, Khrushchev just thinks people should go ahead and have these children. It's all about the numbers. It's just quantitative increase. It's not qualitative increase in family structure. I mean, they don't particularly care about the fact that this means a lot of children are being born to go straight into orphanages. They said, that's okay. You know, you have the option to put them in the orphanage, the state will pay for it. I don't know. It's a very good question. They're sort of stuck with this model, and they can never move beyond it.
Jane?
No, go ahead, Al.
Yeah.
Oh, just that, like, even after performance, the tax carries on even after struggle, like, get rid of them. So it's like the punitive model is like not just these.
Yeah, I mean, they leave it in place. It stays in place until 1991. Although at that point, it's been limited to just be paid by childless single men and childless married couples. So they move away from, I mean, and this is the thing, a lot of people, I would imagine, didn't necessarily have a problem with people being taxed somehow to support those who had children. But the fact that people who had less than 3 children, if you had 1 or 2 children, were still paying it, that was really perceived as a big slight. People were very upset about this, particularly since, you know, having even 2 children was a quite steep financial burden in this period. So that wasn't enough was somehow quite offensive to many people.
Katie, Bridget?
Yeah, so I read your paper a few days ago, so I'm sorry if maybe you went over this, but I was wondering if you noticed any kind of nationality component to the tax, like whether either in practice or the people writing the letters, if they tend to be members of certain nationalities, or the Soviet Union had an idea that certain nationalities, you know, may have needed this tax more than others, or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a very strong national component to who isn't paying the tax. So the arrears are highest in Central Asia and the Caucasus, pretty consistently. At the same time, the interesting thing is that the arrears are really high there, and also the number of people who are not paying the tax because they have enough children are also there, right? So the main sort of body of complaints is coming from the RSFSR and Ukraine, and then the Baltics. I mean, in particular Latvia for some reason. People in Latvia really hated this tax. I don't know why. Well, I mean, I know why they hated it, but I don't know why that particular republic was very upset about it. But so there is definitely something of an east-west divide in terms of who doesn't have to pay and then who just isn't paying because they don't have the money to pay it, right? Yeah.
Bridget?
I also learned a great deal from this paper, but I, like Anne, was struck in particular by the fact that some people were having to show up to pay the taxes, and that the state is kind of, in some superficial way even, going against its own interest and going to all the trouble to hound people and to calculate kind of arrears and all of these things. And I think in some ways my question is linked to both Anne's and Yanni's, because I thought, is there something else going on here that's not being discussed? I mean, it's fairly clear that the people who are writing in and are complaining are angry about having to give over their money. And it's clear that the state also has to think about producing children and also caring for children. But I wondered, you know, what else is being discussed internally? Is there a larger kind of philosophical principle at work? And Yanni can correct me if I'm misrepresenting his argument, but I did wonder, is there also a logic here of bringing the peasant to the administrative outlet, right? Bringing the peasant face to face with the state and integrating people and forcing them to participate in all of these things. Is that going on in these discussions?
I mean, I don't see a lot of that discussion in the internal sources, if only because mostly they're focused on the fact that people just ignore it. I mean, there are just millions of people who just don't pay it. And then they're wasting so much money and resources and time hounding them down that that's actually the reason that they scale back on the taxes for peasants in the end. I don't think it's any particular moral imperative to, alleviate the plight of the post-war countryside. It's more, they give up. They give up getting the money out of those people, particularly out of peasants and then out of the women who are married to these war invalids. They just give up. But the sort of larger philosophical question is an interesting one, because there's always this anxiety that there are people making money outside of their field of vision, outside of their ability to know about it, and they're never quite sure how to get at those people, right? And so even though a lot of them are very socioeconomically marginal people who are not making a lot of money, or maybe they do some sort of petty business activities, they're certainly not making huge amounts of money. There's always this anxiety somehow that they don't know how they're making money. They don't have any way of doing this. That's the sort of logic behind the lump sum tax, right? Even though they know it's regressive, they say, well, okay, if you kind of apply it widely, then they get enough out of it, but they don't have any ability to know what people can pay. They just sort of know that some people can pay and many can't, and that will kind of even itself out. But it's just an incredibly inefficient way of managing this as a source of revenue. And so people are pushing within the Ministry of Finance to make it progressive based on how much these people earn, but there's no minimum income exemption until it's actually 1954 when it gets brought in. So if you have no income, you're still required to pay because it's a head tax. So the whole thing is just kind of contradictory in so many different ways. Yeah.
I was just thinking about the Khrushchev period and how one of the characteristics is the amnesty, the Gulag amnesty, and this sort of effort that comes to mobilize society without violence and coercion that was there before. And I wondered if, sort of, also in response to Yanni's question, if somehow this fiscal policy, is this in the broader context of a fiscal policy to try to mobilize the population in a non-violent way? Or are there other kinds of punitive financial policies that you've come across?
In the Khrushchev era? Or
No, I mean in the post-war period. I'm just wondering if the roots of this, if there's any kind of shift.
I mean, so Khrushchev comes up with this tax, but he comes up with it in 1941, right?
Yeah.
And it's absolutely in this context of wartime emergency.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is that they never really figure out when they can call that state of emergency over on this war. Because in many other ways they say, the war's economic consequences have been completely liquidated. This is this recurring thing they say about the 1947 currency reform. We no longer have economic consequences of the war. It's completely not true. But this is how they talk about it. But with the birth rate, they just can't make this argument. And so it always maintains that punitive dimension. Because they, and people write in all the time also saying, the war's over. The war's been over for 10 years. Why do we need to be doing this? Shouldn't our improving living standards be automatically making people want to have more children? Why do we need to force them? They never have a good answer for this. But I mean, I don't think it's linked to a shift per se by the Khrushchev period. Although I do think that's happening in other dimensions of the larger fiscal policy. One of the things that's going to come out in my book is how, after they default on these coercive state bonds in 1957, they no longer force people to give money in investments anymore. They shift over to lottery tickets, which people could also argue are just equally regressive and not a good investment. But there's more of this idea that you should just voluntarily invest your money in the government, put your money in the bank, these kinds of things. So there is a shift there. But in taxation, it's very strange because everyone within the Ministry of Finance below the level of Zverev, who's mostly he's the Minister of Finance, he quits in protest in 1960 over the next currency reform. They're all pushing just to reform the income tax structure, to find better scales for the tax brackets, this kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden Khrushchev says, no, we're getting rid of all taxes. And I don't know why. I don't know.
He's just about to announce communism.
Yeah, and I think it is linked to this. So let's just get rid of all of it. It's all flawed. It's all backward. We don't need this under communism. We're moving to communism. And then they're sort of stuck trying to figure out how to make that happen. But the fun of, especially with the bachelor tax, I just don't see any change in thinking about the bachelor tax on Khrushchev's part. It's still considered punitive. He has no problem with that.
The punishment is about establishing norms. basically.
Yeah.
So it's a
The
negative
norm for
statement.
children.
It's a negative statement, the normal family
Yeah.
has 3 children or something
Yes.
like that. So it can be turned into a positive statement as well. Jane?
Well, lots of questions here. I mean, first of all, I'm familiar with this tax, because when I was in the Soviet Union in 87, 88, and I had a bunch of friends, they told me about this. And then, I think it was a single woman, I mean, as I recall, a single woman.
Single men, but not single women.
That's what you said here,
Yeah.
but she was a single woman who told me about this tax. But they were just kind of joking about it.
Yeah.
They were joking about all the bad things.
There are a lot of rude jokes about this tax, yeah.
Yeah, but, some observations, I mean, this not being able to tax the individual peasant. I mean, of course, this reminds me of Yanni's book and great work. But here we have a situation where, from what you're saying, the government isn't trying. I mean, it's kind of the opposite story. If in the 19th and early 20th century, the state was really trying hard to tax in order to get to know and come in, and those knowledge taxation policies were so linked, as Yanni argued, then here we have, they've deliberately collectivized the peasants, and they don't want to go further. I mean, it doesn't seem to be that there's a drive for, but that's a question, that's one question. If they could have, would they have wanted to back to an individualized, household tax? Would you see that drive for knowledge that was so important in the early period? So that's one question. But then the other question is also, I mean, let's take the Ministry of Finance a little bit at its word, and basically go one back to the big question, which seems to be connected to your book on money. I mean, why does a socialist or a communist economy have to tax? I mean, by this time, is nobody thinking about these questions? And are they sort of stuck in a frame, when it's back to this framework question that comes from a much earlier period, and they don't even bother to ask these kinds of questions anymore? I want to hear what you think about that. And it seems to me, if they are stuck in some kind of framework, I want to hear more about whether the top just doesn't want to bother with getting rid of taxation and really going to communism except for push-ups outwards. And then you see the popular response to this is not to buy the ideology, which to me seems actually defensible. The ideology is that everybody's paying for the children of the whole society, right? That's a defensible, it's a defensible position in a socialist, communist country, I don't have children, you do have children, we all pay for all the children, so, isn't it a consistent position? I mean, it seems to me that there's a consistent position
I was
there.
going to talk to you about this.
I think it happens, actually, I think it happens in our society.
But I think it's pretty much the same logic behind taxing people toward, schools when they don't have children everywhere else, right?
Right,
It's not
I mean,
that
I
different,
think they do, but I'm not making a comparison, I'm thinking about how do they think about it. It's actually a perfectly defensible position, but, as you say, of course, nobody buys the explanation.
Right.
Which to me is talking about this severe ideological failure of the regime. If everybody's interpreting these policies in the light of their, let's put it from their selfish, family, individualized, perspective, then there's an ideological failure about community that's happened. Okay, so those are my big questions. Really, are basically, are they stuck in this framework at this time? There's no more discussion, and the other is, why does that be a really big one? Why do they have to tax?
Okay, so in terms of why do they have to tax, there is a lot of discussion, I gather, from the sheer number of people who by the mid-1950s are writing it, and it's a lot. I couldn't believe it, really, like diella upon diella of files of letters. People are starting to say, okay, so if we're moving rapidly toward communism, and this is a transitional period during which, okay, we have some transitional vestiges of capitalism, when are they starting to go away? I mean, on top of it, this system of doing all these deductions is incredibly complicated. So the people you find writing in most often are bookkeepers, factory bookkeepers, write in saying, please, please, let's just get rid of these income taxes, make this simpler, let's just pay people some wage that they know every month what they're going to get, because they have to deal with all the workers coming in complaining, saying, why is, because on top of it, so if you're paying 6% of your salary, or your monthly salary, and every month your salary is going up and down, your deduction's also going up and down, and people just don't have a clear sense of a firm wage. This makes it complicated to budget and everything else. There's like this practical reason to get rid of it, that it gets a lot of currency. But there are people writing in saying, you're telling us we're moving quickly toward communism. The war validated Soviet socialism. We're supposed to be now moving toward communism in 20 years. How are we not trying to dismantle these things? Why are they becoming ever more embedded? So I do think that there is a sense within the top leadership that we need to start thinking about how to do this. The problem is that within the Ministry of Finance, they have a completely different task. Their task is to balance the books. Their task isn't really to do the ideological thing. Even though they are the ones who are responsible for dealing with people writing in and explaining why they have to. Something that you should know is that they responded to every single letter that was written to them. Every single last one. Like not an individualized letter, but a little slip of paper, and they had a form reply for every single scenario in which someone wrote in saying, well, I had a hysterectomy and therefore I can't have children, and then they would say an inability to have children is not sufficient grounds to get out of this tax is about blah, blah, blah. I mean, they had this, so this was incredibly complicated on their side. They wanted to minimize this, but they need the money to come in. They need to balance the books. So I think there's institutional logic at work here as well, and then there's the ideological one, and they don't always have the same goal, and they're butting heads about this. In terms of individualization, yes, there are actually people within the Ministry of Finance who say we need to stop taxing peasants in this way. We need to actually move toward progressive taxation for peasants. They don't win. They just don't. This person, Mariakin, who I mentioned, he's something of a rebel economist. between industries. So they are not dealing in cash when they're buying resources mostly, although it's not that way totally in practice, but this is the way it's supposed to work. So that's a system of debits and credits, and that's bank money. The cash money is what gets paid out into the hands of the population. It's currency, right? And so for the purpose of maintaining my sanity, I am not dealing with bank money. I can't. I'm dealing with the money that is a sort of physical thing in the world that goes out from the government and back into the government.
So what's your overall argument, since you're in the process
Oh,
of doing this book? You know, we've got this one part, but what's the whole?
Okay.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, I mean, so the larger project is going to be sort of, I don't know that I can answer the question of what they finally decide money is doing, per se. I'm more trying to flesh out what they try to do with it after the war, when they realize suddenly, you know, the money situation is really, really bad. It's inflated, you can't buy anything. There's also this massive rise of barter during the war. They want to have money come back as a means of exchange, right? And that has all kinds of implications for every other aspect of the economy, because, you know, they need to reform pensions, they need to have a minimum wage, you know, enough for people to afford things in shops if they're going to have money be the means of exchange and not barter or rationing. I mean, actually even rationing in the Soviet Union involved money, because you didn't get physical things for the coupons. You were given the right to buy things at a price, right? That was what rationing was. So I don't know what my argument is just yet, but the way that I looked at it in the dissertation was, I was arguing that money increasingly mediated this kind of paternalistic relationship between workers and the state, in which they were given money and they were expected to give money back to the government as a form of loyalty, support, and also their economic contribution to the smooth functioning of this, you know, this consumer economy that they were creating. So, you know, you're supposed to invest your money in state bonds, put it in savings accounts, buy all your food in state stores rather than going to the market. And so it was this kind of this language almost between workers and the state. For the larger book project, I think I want it to be not just specifically about workers. I'm bringing peasants back into it because they're largely excluded from that relationship. You know, they're often not paid in money, they're paid in labor days, they're taxed in money, however, and they're not supposed, and they're long believed to have this very problematic petit bourgeois attitude toward money. So I'm trying to see how they rehabilitate money as something they can make use of during the transition and use it to improve people's living standards, you know, allow them to earn more, spend more, have a degree of financial stability. Yeah.
So if peasants aren't paid in money, what do they still have to go buy something at their little, a whole store, right? What do
Yes.
they do?
So they're not paid for their work, well, most collective farms do not pay their workers in money. They pay them in labor days, which is basically the remainder. It's almost like a share of the produce that's left over after they've made the compulsory deliveries to the state. So they get a chunk of wheat or stuff, whatever it is they make, then they take it to the market and they sell it and they make money on the market. And then of course they have their private plots as well. So they're earning income, but they're
So
not
they're
earning income
problematic.
from the government.
Yeah, so they are problematic in that sense.
Yeah. And the stores in the countryside had nothing to buy them anyway.
And here's the issue,
Yeah.
going back to the question, is a good
Yeah.
one, but the issue is, it's not so much, you know, as peasants, they're detestable.
Right.
There's that element too, there's no question.
Yeah,
But they're invisible, they
Yes.
can't be traced, but
Yeah.
everyone else you talk
they
about.
can't monitor their income.
That's right, so everyone else you talk about who have the much higher rates of payment
Mhm.
are the ones who earn wages and salaries.
Yes, yeah.
They're on the books and they're held at source.
Yeah.
Peasants can't do that.
I mean, I was just looking at another one of Maryakin's reports. I feel I'm starting to sympathize with this man because I read all his reports and I feel like he's just screaming at a brick wall and bashing his head against the brick wall and no one's listening to him. And I just read another one of his reports the other day about how by the late 1950s, you know, they have these income tax brackets for the people who are not in the category of workers, like not рабочие служащие, but like, you know, everybody else, right? Artisans, people who are private practice doctors, lawyers, whatever. They're saying these income tax brackets absolutely do not correspond to reality because they go up to something like 50,000 rubles per month, and the vast majority of these people are earning something like maybe 1,000 rubles at the most. So no one's actually paying those high rates of tax. But they have these heavy rates of taxation because that tax system was put in place in 1943 during the war when they're making such enormous amounts of money because of the market being, you know, much more expansive during the war. They never revised the tax rates. So they tax these people out of existence. But then you do have you know, some pockets of people who make large amounts of money who are kind of unknowable and are almost these sort of, you know, they become kind of these straw men for them to say, well, but what about those people who we know who are speculators who are making loads of money? But they're really the exception by this period, that they inform so much of the thinking about making money outside of state-paid activities. Yeah. So.
Well, I mean, of course, you can read this as an indictment of, you know, Russian communist planned economy. Not planned economy, but Russian communist planned, yeah. But, so I want to ask you, I mean, this question about why are they surprised when there's a lot of money and they're earning not the right goods. So somebody's not planning right.
Right.
And so here I want to ask, and you've convinced us that, I think that, you know, it's not the Ministry of Finance that's responsible for planning. They're behaving like good professionals. They're doing, and I find that very plausible, the argument they're good professionals. And they only have certain language they can use when they
They're
want to talk about
mathematicians and economists. And,
yeah. But, so this planning business, so what about, I mean, this is a very just kind of old-fashioned question about gender here. I mean, you know, if they've been planning to produce, you know, things that people wanted, then they wouldn't have this imbalance. So do you,
Yeah.
we used to say in the old communist days, you know, I mean, we would say, you know, obviously nobody's thinking about what consumer goods and what people want and not making Tampax and, you know, all these other things and no contraception and so on. No one's listening to what the people who really run the families, and to my mind, really run the economy, that's females in the late Soviet period, nobody's listening to them. But do you see anything like that? I mean, do you see a gender component that?
I mean, there are almost no women who work in any of these ministries.
Yeah.
I haven't come across a single female name on a Ministry of Finance thing. I mean, I've only looked a little bit into Gosplan, because I'm not typically looking at I've looked at some of the trade plans, but I'm more interested in prices rather than the actual production plans themselves. Almost no one, there's it's astounding actually. There really are almost no women who have jobs in these ministries, really. As for how they're managing demand, I mean, this is a real problem for them by the 1950s.
Sure,
Yeah.
Is that the higher levels you're talking
Yeah.
about, or any level?
No, at lower levels there are women who are tax inspectors, there are women who are bookkeepers, they're that. But I mean, at the levels of people who are trying to sway policy, I can't think of a single female economist. I just can't. That's actually very sad. But yeah, I mean, this and by the 1950s, they're very worried about this question of not knowing the consumer as well, right? This is why they start, they launched that, what's it called? There's a sort of social research institute where they're doing all of these questionnaires and trying to figure out you have the rise of social science in this period. People are very concerned with this question, but they don't necessarily have a good way of responding to it. I don't know.
I'm just sort of trying to wrap my head around this conversation about the sort of the 60s or the slowdown in '62, the whole process.
We've been having this conversation.
I know, where does money play into this whole thing? Does money have? I mean, it seems to me that that if you look at what's happening, if you take it not from '62 but like '58, it seems that everything is going in the right direction, right? Even if you look at the policies that you lay out here in terms of what Khrushchev thinks they're going to be doing, they have all these ideas of reform, they have all these ideas of rescinding taxes, of basically rewriting the tax code, of creating consumer goods. Consumer goods, I mean, there is a sort of...
And they are actually making things,
And then suddenly, for some reason, somewhere around 1962, everything seems to grind to a halt, right? Which suggests that it's not just that the system is somehow like structure, is perpetually creating stuff that people don't need. That suggests a crisis of overaccumulation of a very sort of classical variety. Which then points to, if you sort of think about that within the context of the role that money is playing, I mean, I think that what we sort of, this conversation has been pointing to over and over again, is that money seems to be playing exactly the same role in this society, despite the language of planning, that it's playing in a capitalist economy in some ways. It's mediating wages. Wages are still the basis of production, and it's still the driving dynamic in some sense. And if you go back to like Leontiev, when in 1943, he's writing about the centrality of the law of value for
Right, the
Soviet
law of value,
economy,
yes.
right? And so in this sense, the question becomes, I mean, I wonder how much in what you're seeing here is much less sort of mystified and Soviet than it is actually sort of a regular inflationary crisis followed by the crash.
No, I mean, it's a good question. Like, I'm hard pressed to kind of say that, because they don't understand it in those terms. I'm trying to sort of think, or at least like I'm being sympathetic to the way that they're understanding the crisis as they see it. And the way that they see it is there is this shot, I think is the word they use, between income and expenses. There's too much money circulating out there outside of their control. And of course, the problem with that is that then a lot of that gets sucked into the market, and that's even more outside of their control. And they're not getting, and then that creates a state revenue crisis because they're not getting the commodity taxes, and the whole thing, it's like pulling a thread on a sweater. It just sort of unravels, right? And I think this is truly one of the reasons Khrushchev gets kicked out, is that and they say this, if you look at the transcript of when he gets kicked out of office, they say, you let this go on for too long, and kept saying everything was fine. So there is this moment in 1962 where nothing is in equilibrium anymore, absolutely nothing. And they panic, and they scale back everything.
You mean that they're out of equilibrium?
Everything's out of equilibrium. The wages and expenses are out of equilibrium. They're not producing enough. They can't, there are big revenue holes in the budget that they just can't plug anymore. And this, I think, actually even starts earlier than that period because, I really do think even by 1958, there are signs of crisis, but they're not really paying attention to them. And so one of the reasons, I have this feeling, and I can't quite prove it, I'm looking for like the document that tells me I'm right about this, but I think that one of the reasons why Khrushchev says we're going to get rid of income taxes in 1960 is because it's a relatively low-cost option of all the options that are around, because this is just at most 10 billion rubles to account for in the budget. They can shift things around and make that money up because people are really feeling the real value of their wages dropping. And this is a very tangible way to say, we're putting more money in your hands, everything will be fine, because they're not changing prices anymore. They haven't reduced retail prices in years, in 5 years at that point. So I think this is almost a kind of giveaway to the public that meets all those ideological needs and seems like it's going to solve the problem of the real value of wages. But of course, it's again picking at that sweater that's unraveling, right? Because then you have to find the money from somewhere else. So I don't know. Again, I can't prove it per se because I haven't seen anyone talk about it in those terms, but I have no other good reason why at that moment in 1960 they say, let's just do this. I know that people have been talking about it for several years beforehand. That's all I know. But it kind of seems like a Khrushchev thing to do, right? Something grandiose, something, that seems very epic. I mean, they're publishing just this enormous amount of propaganda in 1960 saying, this is like this, eons old, decade old, whatever, dream of workers. We need to get rid of taxes. We will be the first country without taxes for 2 years. They don't even get rid of them all. They just reduce them. But yeah, so I don't know.
You're still talking about balances, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's not a capitalist way of looking at money.
No, it balances absolutely the way they think about all of it, yeah.
So that's a matter of, and it's not even quite equilibrium, right?
Mhm.
It's certainly balanced though.
Yeah.
Which means that what goes in has to come out.
Yes. And ideally, the trade turnover should be slightly higher than what they're paying out in wages, because there's always a sense that there's still money out there circulating that needs to find its way back home. Yeah.
And that puts a premium on stability.
Yes, yes.
As opposed to.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've been thinking about socialist morality, which has become several people's questions, as sort of something underneath this tax, both in the sense of kind of this idea that you should be like providing for society, but also in sort of like losing the family.
Yeah.
But then this is sort of linked to Yami's comment about sort of the tax not doing the didactic work that it's supposed to do because we don't tell people what the tax is supposed to be doing anyway. But kind of knowing that presumably the norms about families and like sexual behavior and love and like that stuff is like people are being educated about that in some other sphere.
Yeah.
So I'm just sort of wondering like what is that saying, because I don't know, are you learning in the Constable you should have 3 children, or are you just learning that you should like wait for marriage when you have sex, or do they even talk about? Like, I mean, I don't know.
The Constable is almost exclusively male.
But they have like those weird booklet
Yeah, no,
things,
you're right, yeah.
So I just sort of like,
Yeah.
where is, like, if the tax is not enforcing the family morality, where is, because presumably that's happening somewhere else, and then on like the socialist morality about like this equality providing to each other, if that
Yeah.
wasn't somewhere else, like perhaps like how do they talk about like the income tax, how do they talk about paying for hospitals, or like I don't have a clue how medicine works in the Soviet Union, but just sort of like that sense.
Yeah, your taxes don't technically pay for any of those things. I mean, this is the really interesting thing. Your taxes don't even pay for your pension. In fact, they make a very big deal of the fact that people don't pay into their pensions. Pensions are given to you by the government. They are not a pay-as-you-go system. In fact, it's very interesting because right now, you know, Putin is doing many things, one of which is trying to change the age of pensions, and then they split the system in 2013 where people who were born before 1967 get the old bestowed upon you pension, which is paid from the government that you do not pay into and over your lifetime, and then people who are younger than that have the option of that version or the pay-as-you-go one, which will theoretically be a larger amount of money and should, you know, the investment should grow, it'll be an invested thing. That's a very foreign concept to many older Russians because the idea was always pension is something you get from the government. They have a pension fund and the money gets allocated into it, but there's no clear sense that your income taxes or any deduction from your wages pay for your pension. You don't pay into it over the course of a lifetime. It's the same thing with things like healthcare, it's the same thing with education. It's all spoken about as this allocation of state money, but it's not something that people directly pay into off of their wages in the way that, you know, you pay a certain amount of tax toward education here, or you know, pay toward your Social Security. There's no concept of this. Those things are all things that are kind of, they come out of the budget in some way, but it's not, there's no one-to-one kind of correlation there.
So then with this child tax, like, so that this model kind of supports the idea that you should be like socially, like, because your payment isn't connected to your healthcare, it's like your payment somehow provides for healthcare for everybody.
Yeah.
So then this child tax is like, is the same model, so then I wonder, like...
No, the child tax is, the idea is that it directly funds the 1944 family law. It's an additional source, and that's the weird thing, because it's not the same as the income tax, where that's just a kind of redistribution of income and a sort of input to the state budget. It is explicitly linked to the family law, because the law is built into the family law itself, right? So the idea is that it only pays for benefits to single mothers, mothers of many children, and state orphanages. That's what it's supposed to pay for. And so that's why they're always very, you know, panicked when it's making too much money, right? Because it's about that, it's about that kind of state of balance. Yeah.
So back to the question that was Ann asked earlier about, you know, how you find out what you're being taxed for, on how it looked to people. So you mentioned, you talked about the peasants, and then you said, well, the worker gets their money, it's taken off their tax. But do they get anything? I mean, do they get a slip of paper that says, this much went to this and this went to that? Because, I mean, it was all in cash, wasn't it?
It was all in cash, you got an envelope
Just
of
when you
cash.
got an envelope of cash.
Yeah.
And so what would you do? Count it up and say, well, gee, you took out.
This is a really big problem.
Yeah.
No, they didn't actually get any kind of breakdown. I mean, it would be written down and they would talk about it with the bookkeeper, but to my knowledge, no. They actually did not get a kind of, you know, monthly slip that said, this is what you got. And so people are complaining constantly, saying, I don't know what I earned. I don't know. Yeah.
It's so interesting, and it's a really strange
Yeah.
thing to me that in, you know, in a system that's kind of uncomfortable with money, in some way, ideologically, there's so much cash around, that so many things are done with cash, and sort of this the physical
Yeah.
object of
Yeah.
money. I thought the answer to that question was going to be, I didn't think that was going to be the answer, that you got all of your
Yeah.
wages in cash.
So when I first came up with this project, one of the stories that Sheila Fitzpatrick told me was when she was living with Igor Satz in the 1960s in the Soviet Union. She was going out to meet somebody, and he said to her, do you need some money? And opened a drawer that was just full of money. And he was like, take it. Just take some money. And she went, what? what do you mean? It's like, there was no concept of, you know, how much do I need? Do I pay you back? It's like, that's the money drawer. And it just always kind of stuck with me because I think for some people that was their reality because they existed in, you know, a sphere in which you know, money wasn't always the only thing that mattered, and it wasn't always the only thing that determined your consumption. That's not the case for very low-paid people who really do have to count those things. So again, it's very dependent on who you're looking at within the society. So I think for very low-paid workers, they probably were haggling with that fourth-place accountant saying, you know, explain to me why this has gone down by 7 rubles this month. I don't understand. Whereas for others, you know, they took their money and they didn't think twice about it. So,
If everybody's accountant has to, is complaining
yeah.
to the Ministry of Finance about having to go through all these calculations, why is the bookkeeper not telling the individual worker how the pay is calculated?
Oh,
That's
they
what-
do, they tell them, they just
They
don't
would.
receive a slip. They
Oh.
don't receive a kind of breakdown.
And you know, that's a part of the didacticism and discipline that's going on here.
Yeah.
And the reliance on the state. So you go in, you get your envelope.
Yeah.
With your money in it. And me, I'm just happy when I go away, but let's say you're unhappy, then the bookkeeper is going to be the one who's going to show you,
Yeah.
and that's going to be in a document that it's usually a sheet,
Yeah,
Could have
there was a
shown to
feminization
anybody.
of that.
and
profession,
it's
yeah.
going to say right here, you did this, you didn't do this, you did this extra piece rate, you didn't do as much piece rate work,
Oh, yeah.
and there's this tax and blah, blah, blah. So, and you can imagine how
Yeah.
she feels about it, and the didactic part is not gonna be very nice. But it is the state showing you,
Yeah.
when you demand it, the state is showing you what you got paid, what you did,
Right.
and why, and it might not be very pleasant.
Right.
And then you could.
But you'd think if didacticism is the purpose, the state would want to show you that all the time as a kind of continuous discipline.
No. The best thing about discipline is unpredictability. I mean,
Yeah.
I really deeply believe that was part of the Soviet disciplinary tactic is in the patriarchal
Well, because
one.
then if you have no clear sense of what your wage is going to be from month to month, the idea is sort of that you would kind of overshoot, right? You would
Yeah.
put in extra
Yeah.
effort so that you would get enough by kind of making, I mean, this is the entire way the financial system is set up in so many ways. And the whole reason I ended up doing this project was because I wrote like an MA thesis on lottery winners in the Soviet Union, because it blew my mind that people could win 100,000 rubles from a state lottery. I didn't even know state lotteries existed. They did. They were everywhere. The way, and then that got me to these lottery bonds, these state bonds that people were forced to buy in 1 month's salary. And the way it worked was you pledged a percentage of 1 month's salary. So the norm was supposed to be 100% of your average monthly wage. People gave more or less, usually more of this, but that meant that there were people giving 300% of their average monthly wage. Their average monthly wage ended up being totally fluctuating from month to month, so you didn't always know precisely how much you gave. This is a very inefficient system, but in the end, because there were so many parts of the Soviet Union that would fail to hit their targets, it covered everyone. So you would hit the all-union target, you would get 101%, but if you break it down by republic, rayon, whatever, there are places that are only maybe hitting 70. So it's this kind of spray shooting approach to meeting the target, to meeting the quotas. And it works, but it's incredibly inefficient, and so it just meant that the whole thing escalated, and that's part of why they default in 1957, is that they owe 260 billion rubles to the Soviet people after 30 years of this. Because it's just not an efficient way of doing it, but there are all these incentives built in to kind of overshoot the mark. And that's what they're expecting people to do, because they don't trust people to just do it, you know, without the more coercive mechanisms. So,
Sounds like you're hopeful then. Doesn't that sound that sort of not really this sort of scattershot way? I mean, when I look at the provincial government reports at the lower level, and it totally confirms what Jan wrote about the taxes, but you know, basically the officials say, well, this district did pretty well on getting their grain collection. That's all that they really worry about, the grain collection. And then this one, oh, not so well, that one, not so well.
Right.
It's you know, utterly imprecise, but, and supposed to be precise. There's all the documents there to fill out and
Right.
everything. But the discourse is really about, oh, some do it and some don't, and some pay and some don't, and, you know, that's the way it is. And nobody seems to think it's remarkable.
yeah.
I mean, I find when it comes to this question of, you know, compulsion and volunteerism and so on, I mean, I found it very difficult to speak in only one voice, because both are happening all the time.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the statements we written in the voice of, we as a collective, we do this and we do that, which sort of draws you, the payer, into it in sort of in an uncomfortable, intimate way, right?
Yeah.
So, because you'd rather probably not be a part of this. On the other hand, you have the choice, which is where it easily spills over into coercion and compulsion.
Yeah.
And the same people could say both things at the same time, sometimes in the same paragraph.
Yeah.
And this is where I think it's, it's good to think of it as a disciplinary regime, because discipline is not about coercion.
Right. Actually, with these state bonds, they actually called them compulsory voluntary, all one word.
Обязательно.
Принудительный.
Yeah.
Because there's a very blurry boundary between taxation and investment and.
So when I'm saying,
Yeah.
so it'd be easy, I mean, sort of directly addressing what you're saying and what you're writing, so it'd be very easy looking at it and say, well, on balance, we look at the civic system and say, well, it can't get away from coercion, and I say that's true.
Yeah.
But it also can't get away from discipline, right? And it can't get away from volunteerism.
Yeah.
So I find it very hard to make only one or the other statement.
Right. That makes sense.
I have sort of an inchoate question. From the history of public health, you see that even in medicine, physicians are thinking of family size in economic terms. And it is really sort of a stunning kind of assessment of a family, that it's sort of like an economic function, or somehow that it has to do with income. And it's having a child as an economic behavior.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if there's any way that, I mean, of course, the pronatalist policy they're tied in other places as well to taxation, but is there any way in which you think this, and maybe Yami also would say, like, is this at all exceptional? This, like, really, this belief in reproduction as such an economic behavior? Is that in Marxist theory, or is it like, where does that come from? And
I mean, I think it's not Marxist per se. I mean, if you've read David Hoffman stuff, which I'm sure you have, it's this idea that reproduction is a resource, that labor power is an economic resource, something that has to be managed by the state, right? They're not alone in thinking this way. I mean, one of the interesting things is this is going on, this using taxes to get people to have more babies. It's going on all over the place, right? But the way that it gets framed is different in all contexts. I mean, I was just reading something about Western Germany after the war, and they won't call it family policy because there's all these Nazi connotations around eugenics and around, influencing people to have children or sterilizing them, et cetera, so they don't call it that. They're not quite as stark about it in other places. In the Soviet Union, I don't know, the language is very interesting around it because they don't seem to shy away from saying we need more children to work in our factories and make more things, and that's not a bad thing. Like, that's not understood as
The French are every bit as upfront about it and from the 1920s.
I mean, I don't think it is very exceptional in the end. I think it's more just that, it becomes kind of exceptionally punitive in some regards because of all of these other structures that they're having to plug this program into. But it's not exceptional in that they're not the only ones who are thinking about birth policies as an economic concept. Yeah.
But I was thinking about the idea of reproduction and all of this. So there seems to be some understanding of reproduction as sort of you know how it is with production, right? So it's an economy based on production,
Yes.
right, first and foremost, which is of course one of its problems, meaning the oversupply of goods and so on. These things have a lot to do with the goal of achieving targets no matter what.
Right.
Output targets and production targets. Now, consumption, quality, does this have anything to do with notions of reproduction as well? Meaning just, produce the children, forget about the infrastructure you need for a child, forget about the parenting you need for a child, does this make sense?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think in particular, Khrushchev was very committed to the quantitative approach. Just make the children. Yeah, just, it doesn't matter. I mean, because in other countries, there becomes more of this way of subtly having the right people have children, wealthier people have children, making sure that people who are going to be a drain on state finances don't have children, etc. No, he's absolutely about just make the children, we put them in state orphanages, you know, and then they get drafted into these labor battalions. It's a very bleak existence. I don't think that he thinks there's a problem with this per se. But I wonder because at the same time, you know, people who would not be paying this tax because they had more children would also be wealthier people because they could afford to have more children. So I don't know. I think there might be more of a qualitative dimension to it, but it's not acknowledged. It's all about just make more children, but then the Minister of Finance never talks about if it's actually doing that.
Well, it's not his department, right?
It's not their department.
Yeah.
They don't care. Yeah.
I have a culture question, and it's not something you'll probably be able to answer, but I'm interested because like in 19th century literature, there are all these texts that are really devoted to trying to figure out what an economy is and process that idea and kind of explain it to people, or at least figure it out. And is there anything comparable in the Civic period, or?
Yeah. I mean, I've been trying to find the kind of cultural products around this, and it's been hit or miss. I mean, there's a lot of visual material that they produce that's trying to kind of, you know, get people to put money in the bank to sort of, you know, this is what the countryside will look like if only you put your money in the bank, etc. You have all of this, and then there are actually a lot of pamphlets and brochures. And interestingly enough, they start having this whole genre of family budget short stories in the 1950s. There's one in particular where someone follows around this family for a year, and they sort of fill out, because there are these
documentary.
Yeah, exactly. And they published the first story in Komsomolska Pravda in, like, I think 1958 maybe, and then they published it as a book. And then there's this kind of genre of how people are spending their money, where are they spending their money, and the lesson with all of that is spend your money in state stores. Don't spend it on the market. The market will cheat you. It won't be the best quality. You know, spend it in state stores, because they're really trying to get people over the course of this period to stop turning to the market. It becomes sort of, you know, we don't need to do that anymore.
Because like in the 19th century, these texts would also be engaged with not such micro issues. It would be like you have to start imagining that there's a connection between what happens to you in your provincial town and what happens when a railroad company goes bankrupt in Ohio. There's some connection between these things.
It's like explaining globalization.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to sort of start to understand that you're part of this system. Which is very different from the kind of micro, how to do your family budget thing. And I can't, you know, I don't know the Soviet period as well, but I can't think of any Soviet literature that's trying to inculcate these.
I mean, there's a lot about what capitalism is doing, right? And how our system is inherently superior, and there's lots of things like that where, you know, they're not, you know, technical literature, but kind of middle of the road explaining, you know, how commodity taxes work in the US or something. There's things like this that are published. I don't know how widespread they are, and I don't know who's really reading them. And then there's this whole genre of the materials that are produced for the agitators, for the people who are embedded, because they're actually financial activists in the Soviet Union who are completely bizarre. In every factory, there would be a committee of people whose job it was to kind of explain financial goals to workers, and they're also the ones who are kind of doing this compulsory voluntary bonds subscription campaigns. Those people, there's all kinds of literature produced for them to help explain these things to workers. But it's more, it's not, they don't assume the workers are going to be reading those books. It's more like you're going to take this and pass it on. Yeah.
The Germans have something similar in the 50s and 60s, a whole lot of literature about what proper consumption is and the need to save and be restrained and carefully budget, and women in particular should not spend frivolously because they had a responsibility to the reconstruction and modernization of West Germany. So it's...
the consumption literature is very targeted at women. It's you know, in fact, the one I'm thinking of now, I think it's called something like Anastasia Grigoryevna, a bad housewife. That's exactly what it's called, and it's about her eventual decision to shop in state stores instead of the market.
Proper government women are always bad housewives. Just frivolous and self-indulgent.
I have another question, which is, you've shown us that there's lots of complaint about the system. You've shown that inside the government there is discussion, but you've shown lots of pushback from below. So overall, And that's what I mean is stepping way back. Do you see the Soviet government actually responding to these complaints?
Yeah.
You know, when we think about this one, it's probably the time, longer way kind of thing. So you can say, you look back at the 19th century, you can say, well, it took them 30 years to
Right.
respond to this, but they did it, you know?
Yeah.
Whereas when we look at the Soviet period, we're looking at 30 years and say, oh my God, they didn't do it.
Right.
You know? My question is, do you see that mechanism of
Yeah.
a kind of response? And actually, when you think about the time period, how do you think about where the major changes were?
Mhm.
Was it responsive?
Yeah.
I'm not going to say, you know, what it's, I can see different responses to this, put it to this
Yeah,
paper.
no, I do actually see them responding. I mean, you see a lot of people writing in. There's this moment right after Stalin dies. It's not just because Stalin has died, but because there's this power struggle, and it sort of opens up the discussion about who's going to be the one to kind of take on. And there's this big sort of debate between Khrushchev and Malankov about who's going to most defend the working class's interests, right? So people are writing into one or the other. That period from 1953 to 1957, roughly, mostly to 1956, the number of letters, the number of types of things people are complaining about, it just expands. And the tone of the letters changes everything. It starts to die off again afterward, except people write in letters that are directly attacking Khrushchev, like in 1962 when the price is up and there's the Novichokhovsk riots. People write in all kinds of letters screaming, swearing at him and everything else, but there's this moment where I think things are changing, things are in flux, and there's this sort of possibility to change things. And it's a very fertile period for reforms. This is when they start to really think about how a lot of the old Stalinist privileges have created new sort of class privileges in the society. They start scaling back on some of the more obvious privileges that elites get. All that, of course, starts to come back again by the end of the decade. But there's this moment, I really do think they're responding to things then. And the thing is that there's no sort of civil society. You can't kind of mobilize around an issue. So you have all these people writing in saying, there's massive inequity in pension amounts. People are getting, 200 rubles a month, and then some people are getting 3,000 rubles a month. And, how can this be in a communist society? But they can't form a kind of AARP, right? There's no kind of way to lobby the government. So people write them, and they respond to this. The government will say, we're getting an enormous amount of complaints. This is clearly evidence that something needs to be done. But then that still means that someone has to kind of take the mantle for that and do something, right?
Mhm.
It isn't always as clear as, there's public pressure and that pressure can, push some of it. I mean, unless there's will for it to happen, it doesn't happen. So, for example, there's a big attempt to reform pensions from 1949 to 1953. Khrushchev actually takes all the credit for reforming pensions in 1956. It's not entirely true. It started earlier, but there was no actual will at the highest level to give the money for it. So they create this whole new law, they spend years trying to do this, no one runs with it. Because there's no real pressure, and Stalin says, nope, not now. And that's the end, right? So we can always kind of hit that dead end, and that's the real problem. So I'm hesitant to say that, there's popular discontent and it kind of makes something happen, but it kind of creates a sense of urgency maybe, but doesn't necessarily mean it's the reason why it ends up getting done. Yeah.
Anything you wanted to, advice you wanted to ask of the people gathered here?
I mean, if anyone has a sort of suggestion about what you think you'd like to see more of, less of, do you feel it's too number heavy? This is something I'm trying really hard to figure out the right balance between too much explanation of policy and numbers and the social narrative. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts about that. Yeah.
I have one practical thing. I think that all the way through, you should have a good presentation of what the range of salaries is.
Oh, yeah.
And you have it at the end part, but not from the beginning. So
Okay.
that we don't have any sense of what this pension means, or we know what 6% means, but we don't know
Right.
how it relates to 150 rubles.
Right.
There are other passages along the way, and this is constantly reminding the reader, you're losing 60 million rubles by doing this, but what does this mean in the scheme of things? So
Yeah.
always put it in
Yeah.
context.
Yeah.
So we know if that's a lot or a little, or...
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is the perpetual thing. I'm always constantly trying to be like, okay, this is a lot of money, or this is not a lot of money.
Yeah.
Just,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think it would be useful if you laid out sometimes the policy options that are being discussed and rejected, or ones that you're surprised are not being
Yeah.
discussed at all, so that the reader can understand even more sharply the parameters and restrictions on these debates.
I wonder, with the figures, it sometimes is helpful to have some numbers, like,
Yeah,
I don't know,
I know what you mean.
just
Like on the lines.
yeah, or just like
Yeah.
data points,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I'm just not sure, I mean, this is very good visually, but maybe, I don't know if there's any way you could actually
Yeah.
put points.
Yeah, I think there's a way. I'm not that tech savvy when it comes to all of the various like macros for these things, but yeah, I think there's a way to do it.
I mean, it probably came through before, but I just want more of an explanation about what changes in 62.
Yeah.
Like, that I think needs to be fleshed out, because it's
Yeah.
rather vague as to what's going on here.
I found your description of taxes on something like page 7 to 13 kind of heavy, but I don't know where to put it else. So,
I know.
I mean, that's very helpful. But just
No, I
sort of
need to
like
crunch that into
some
a
other things
more
like
compact
structure,
unit.
or like,
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
I don't need quite so much background, or maybe you
Mhm.
could like put it to different pieces, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if I need to know about the agricultural tax exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I need to know that like peasants aren't taxed in the same way, but I don't.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, I struggled with this one because the reason I ended up putting a lot of the stuff in about the agricultural tax is because when they finally do let the peasants out of the bachelor tax, because it's been joined to the bachelor tax, and so I didn't know if I needed to deal with that issue there or put it back. And so, yeah, I mean, it's got to go somewhere, but in I think a more compact form than it currently is. So I opted on the side of just front loading it. But yeah, no, it's a good point. Yeah.
Well, good.
Thank you.
Good luck with the manuscript.
Thank you.